Today I'm going to be talking about the book Resistance, Rebellion, and Death by Albert Camus. This book isn't a novel with one story, instead it's a collection of essays where Camus shares his thoughts about war, justice, freedom, rebellion, death, and what it means to be human. The first part of the book focuses on resistance. Camus wrote many of these essays during and after World War II. He explains that when people face injustice or oppression, they have a responsibility to stand up against it. Even if resisting is dangerous, he believes it's the right thing to do because staying silent allows injustice to continue. The second part is about rebellion. Camus explains that rebellion starts when someone says this isn't right. However, he also warns that people who fight against oppression can become just as cruel as the people they're fighting if they lose their sight of their values. He believes rebellion should always respect human life and dignity. The third part focuses on death and the meaning of life. Camus believes that life doesn't come with easy answers and everyone eventually dies. Instead of seeing that as hopeless, he argues that it should encourage us to appreciate life more and create our own purpose through the choices we make. The book also includes essays about artists and writers. Camus believes that art should tell the truth about the world and about people. He thinks artists have a responsibility to be honest about injustice, but they also shouldn't create art that is only meant to spread political ideas. Overall, the main message of the book is that people should stand up against injustice while still respecting the value of every human life. Camus believes that even though the world can be unfair and sometimes meaningless, we can still choose to live with honesty, courage, and compassion. Personally, I really enjoyed reading this book because I found Camus's writing to be direct and effective. Even though the ideas are philosophical, I didn't think they were confusing. I liked how he explained complex topics like justice, rebellion, and death in a clear way that made me think about them from a different perspective. One idea that stood out to me was that people should stand up against injustice without becoming cruel themselves. I think that's an important message because it's easy to justify doing the wrong thing if you believe you're fighting for the right cause. Camus argues that our values should stay with us even during difficult times, and I agree with that. Overall, I think Resistance, Rebellion, and Death is a powerful collection of essays. It encourages readers to think about morality, freedom, and personal responsibility. Even though it was written many years ago, I think its ideas are still relevant today and can apply to many situations in the modern world. The first essay, Letters to a German Friend, is written as a series of letters to an imagined German friend during World War II. Camus writes from the perspective of someone outside of Germany who's trying to explain how Nazi propaganda and Hitler's rule have changed the way his friend sees the world. Rather than sounding hateful, the letters feel disappointed and almost personal. It seems like Camus is grieving the loss of someone he once respected because his friend has chosen power and violence over justice and humanity. At the same time, Camus defends the idea that true strength comes from standing up for human dignity, even in the face of war. When I read it, I saw it as someone trying to reach a friend who had slowly been influenced by propaganda. It didn't sound like Camus hated this person. Instead, it felt like he was disappointed that someone he cared about had accepted ideas that justified cruelty and oppression. To me, the essay is about how dangerous propaganda can be because it can completely change the way good people think. It also shows that disagreement doesn't always come from hatred. It can come from caring enough to tell someone they've lost their way. The second essay, The Liberation of Paris, is about Paris finally being freed at the end of World War II. At first, I expected it just to be about celebrating the aftermath and freedom, but it wasn't really like that. Camus is obviously happy that Paris is free, but he spends more time talking about what happens after it. He basically says that freedom doesn't fix everything by itself. People still have to make good choices and build a society that's fair and just. When I was reading it, it kind of felt like Camus was telling people not to get carried away just because the war was ending. He wanted them to remember why they fought in the first place. To me, the essay is less about winning and more about what people do with that victory. I think he's saying that if people forget their values after they're free, then they could end up making the same mistakes all over again. The third essay, The Flesh, felt more personal than the first two. Instead of focusing mostly on war or politics, Camus talks about what it means to be human and how our physical lives affect the way we think and feel. He writes about things like suffering, desire, and being connected to the world around us. It isn't really telling a story, it's more like he's trying to explain something about the human experience. It felt like Camus was saying that we can't ignore our emotions or our physical lives because they're part of who we are. Even though he talks about some deep ideas, I thought he explained them in a pretty direct way. The essay feels like it's about accepting both the good and the difficult parts of being human instead of pretending they don't exist. In Pessimism and Tyranny, Camus talks about how fear and hopelessness can make people accept dictators and oppressive governments. He argues that when people believe nothing can get better, they're more willing to give up their freedom in exchange for someone promising order or security. It's like Camus was warning people not to let themselves become too pessimistic. If people stop believing that justice or freedom are possible, then it's easier for tyranny to take over. I liked how direct he was with this idea. He wasn't just criticizing dictators, he was also explaining how ordinary people can slowly accept them if they lose hope. To me, the essay is a reminder that staying hopeful and thinking for yourself is one of the best ways to resist oppression. In The Unbeliever and Christians, Camus talks about the relationship between people who believe in God and people who don't. Instead of arguing that one side is right, he focuses on what they have in common. He believes both believers and non-believers should work together and defend justice, compassion, and human dignity, even if they have different reasons for believing those things. What stood out to me was how Camus wasn't trying to create an argument between religion and atheism. He seemed more interested in finding common ground. I liked how respectful and direct he was because he focused on people's actions instead of their beliefs. To me, the essay is saying that people don't have to agree on everything to respect each other and work towards the same goal. In Why Spain, Camus explains why Spain still mattered after World War II. He argues that even though the war had ended, people were ignoring the dictatorship in Spain under Franco. Camus believed that if people were serious about defending freedom and democracy, they couldn't just overlook oppression because it was politically convenient. What I took away from this essay is that Camus wanted people to be consistent with their values. If they fought against tyranny in one country, they shouldn't ignore it somewhere else just because it was easier. I enjoyed how he pointed out that justice shouldn't be dependent on politics or convenience. The essay felt like it was about holding people accountable and making sure freedom means the same thing everywhere. In Defense of Freedom, Camus argues that freedom is something people have to protect because it can disappear if they're not careful. He talks about how governments and people in power often try to limit freedom by using fear, violence, or control. Camus believes that real freedom also comes with responsibility, and that people have to stand up for it instead of assuming it will always be there. This essay works because of how straightforward it was. Camus didn't make freedom sound like an abstract idea, he made it feel like something people have to choose every day through their actions. The essay is saying that freedom isn't guaranteed, and if people stop defending it, they risk losing it without even realizing it. In Algeria, Camus talks about the conflict between France and Algeria, and how both sides were being affected by violence. Again, instead of completely siding with one group, he argues that innocent people were the ones suffering the most. It seems he believes that violence only creates more violence, and that lasting peace has to come through justice and understanding instead of revenge. One thing I appreciated about this essay was that Camus didn't try to make the situation seem simple. He admitted there were real problems, but he also believed that hurting innocent people wasn't the answer. I liked how direct he was about the value of human life, even when people disagreed politically. In my opinion, the essay is about remembering that real people are caught in the middle of conflicts, and that solving problems could never come at the cost of losing our humanity. In Hungary, Camus writes about the Hungarian people after the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. He condemns the Soviet Union for using military force to crush the revolution and argues that the people of Hungary were fighting for freedom and the right to decide their own future. Even though the uprising was defeated, Camus believes their courage and willingness to resist oppression should not be forgotten. I found it interesting that Camus spends just as much time honoring the people who stood up for their freedom as he does criticizing the Soviet government. He makes it clear that even when a fight doesn't end in victory, it can still be meaningful. For me, the essay is about having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the outcome seems impossible. In Reflections on the Guillotine, Camus argues against the death penalty. He believes that no government should have the power to deliberately take someone's life, even if that person has committed a terrible crime. He questions whether executions actually prevent crime and says that they often create more fear instead of justice. Throughout the essay, he explains why he thinks punishment should protect society without becoming another act of violence. I enjoyed how confident Camus was in making his argument. He didn't just rely on emotion, he gave reasons for why he believed the death penalty was wrong. Even if someone doesn't agree with him, I think he makes people stop and think about whether execution is really justice or just another form of violence. To me, the essay is about recognizing that justice should be fair and humane, not based on revenge. But I do indeed disagree. In The Artist and His Time, Camus talks about the role artists have in society. He argues that artists shouldn't ignore the problems happening around them, but they also shouldn't let politics completely control their work. He believes that art should tell the truth about the world while still expressing creativity and individuality. Camus didn't expect artists to choose between making good art and speaking out about important issues. He believed they could do both. At the same time, he warned that if art becomes nothing more than political propaganda, it loses what makes it meaningful. In my opinion, this essay is about finding a balance between being honest about the world and staying true to yourself as an artist. One thing I noticed throughout the book was that Camus kept coming back to the same symbols and ideas. The first symbol is the guillotine. It's obviously a real object, but I think it also represents governments having the power to decide who lives and dies. It seems Camus uses it to question whether the death penalty is really justice or if it's just another form of unnecessary violence. I actually disagree with him on that point because punishment is necessary for those who've done atrocities, but I still think he made a strong argument. Another symbol is rebellion. Camus doesn't see rebellion as just fighting or starting a revolution. He sees it as standing up for what's right while still respecting other people. I liked that because he believes you shouldn't lose your morals just because you're fighting for a good cause. One of the last symbols I noticed was freedom. Throughout the book, Camus treats freedom as something that has to be protected. He argues that people can't just assume it'll always be there. If nobody stands up for it, it can slowly disappear. There are also a few ideas that show up over and over again. One of them is human dignity. I feel like almost every essay comes back to the idea that every person's life has value no matter what's happening politically or during a war. Another one is resisting tyranny. Camus is constantly warning against dictatorship and governments that abuse their power. He believes people have a responsibility to push back against oppression instead of accepting it. The last big idea I noticed was moral responsibility. I think this is probably one of the biggest messages in the whole book. Camus argues that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but people still have a responsibility to stand up for justice instead of staying silent. All things considered, I think these symbols and repeated ideas are what connected all of the essays together. Even though each essay talks about something different, they all come back to the same question of how people should act when they're faced with injustice or oppression. Another thing I noticed about resistance, rebellion, and death is that Camus uses different literary techniques to make his ideas feel more personal and meaningful. The first one I noticed was setting. In Letters to a German Friend, the setting of World War II is important because it creates the background for the conflict between Camus and his imagined friend. The war isn't just a historical event in the essay. It represents a time when people's beliefs and morals were being tested. The setting helps show why ideas like resistance, freedom, and justice mattered so much. Another technique I noticed was imagery. Camus describes an innocent boy sitting in the back of a wagon. That image stood out to me because it shows the human side of the war. he doesn't just talk about the politics or the armies. He shows the effect those choices have on real people who had no control over what was happening. It makes the suffering caused by war feel more personal, because it is. Camus also uses personification throughout the book, especially when he talks about ideas like freedom, justice, and Europe. He describes these things almost like they are living things with meaning and purpose. For example, when he says, "For you, Europe is a property, but we belong to it," he makes Europe feel like more than just a place. It becomes connected to values, history, and the people who live there. The last technique I noticed was framed narrative. Letters to a German Friend is written as a series of letters, which creates a frame of the entire essay. Instead of simply explaining his beliefs, Camus represents them as a conversation with someone he once respected. This makes the conflict feel more personal because he isn't just arguing against the idea, he is also expressing disappointment towards someone he cared about who had been influenced by propaganda. These techniques also connect to some of the quotes I chose from the book. The first quote I chose is, "For you, Europe is a property, but we belong to it," from Letters to a German Friend. I think this quote is important because it shows the difference between how Camus saw Europe and how he believed the Nazis saw it. He argues that Europe isn't something to own or control. Instead, it's something people are connected to through its history, culture, and values. I liked this quote because it showed that Camus believed power shouldn't come before humanity. The second quote I chose is, "This is what separated us from you. We made demands. You were satisfied to serve your nation. We dreamed to give ours her truth." Also from Letters to a German Friend. I think this quote is important because it explains the main disagreement between Camus and the imagined German friend. Camus believes people should challenge injustice and search for the truth, while the friend is willing to follow his country without questioning it. To me, this quote shows why Camus thought thinking for yourself was so important. The third quote is, "An execution is not simply death. It is just as different from the privation of life as a concentration camp is from prison." From Reflections on the Guillotine. Even though I don't agree with Camus' position on the death penalty, I still think this quote is important because it shows how strongly he believed governments shouldn't deliberately take someone's life. He wanted readers to think about whether execution is really a justifiable force. And I think it's one of the strongest arguments in the book. The last quote is, "The artist cannot serve today those who make history. He must serve those who are subjected to it." From The Artist and His Time. I like this quote because it explains what Camus thought the role of the artist should be. He believed artists shouldn't just support people in power. Instead, they should represent ordinary people who are affected by the decisions of those in power. I think that's still a relevant idea today because art can give voice to people who might not otherwise be heard. Another one of the ideas I found most interesting in Resistance, Rebellion, and Death is Camus' belief that staying silent is still a choice. He argues that when people know something is wrong but choose not to speak up, they're allowing that wrong to continue. I don't think he's saying every silent person is a bad person. I think he's pointing out that our actions, or even our lack of action, still have consequences. I think it's really difficult to speak up because most people don't want to stand out. It's very common that people are afraid of being judged, rejected, or becoming the next target. Sometimes it's easier to convince yourself that someone else will step in, or that the problem isn't really your responsibility. That is shown repetition of being a normal reaction. It's also why so many people stay quiet even when they know something isn't right. As a teenager, I think everyday resistance looks similar and different than it did during the time Camus was writing. Resisting dictatorships or living through a world war is still sadly happening today, and even most of us online are resisting against it. But when it comes to teenagers fighting outside of their phones or other devices, it's almost silent. Sometimes we're not even standing up for people in our own schools, families, or communities. Teenagers today seem to be more self-conscious and secretive. They seem more afraid of backlash than we were back then. It shows that in modern day, teenagers are now starting to get used to living a double life. What's on screen isn't the same as what's off screen, causing a community to be meeker in present but loud online. But at least we still have fighters. And these are all still choices. They show whether we are willing to stand by our values even when it's uncomfortable. One thing I took away from Camus is that resistance doesn't always have to be dramatic. Sometimes it's just deciding not to stay silent. Even if speaking up doesn't completely solve the problem, it can still make a difference because it shows that not everyone is willing to accept what's happening. Overall, I think these quotes and literary techniques show the main ideas throughout the book. Camus is constantly talking about how people should respond to injustice, and his answer is that people should fight for truth and freedom while still protecting human dignity. I rate this book a 9.5 out of 10 because it makes me feel like I'm not alone in the world.